Hello, I am reading How to Read Slowly, Chapter 1, and you may hear people, my kids in the background and stuff, but okay, let's see how well this is going to work. Chapter 1, How to Read Slowly by Paul Little, I believe it is. A Method in Our Madness, an introduction to reading with the mind. My father is a rancher, a retired purebred Hereford breeder, to be exact. All his life, he has wanted to take over the small Nebraska ranch I was raised on. Very early, he must have known that that wasn't going to work out. I always had my nose in other things, like electronics, ham radio, and books. I remember one summer home from college and without a job, I went with our family on the annual Hereford tour. I may be saying that type of horse wrong. A caravan of 50 cars and 150 ranchers trailed its way from ranch to ranch, where cattlemen displayed their herds and let their fellow ranchers and potential customers know just how good their cattle were. A lot of pride went into being selected to be a stop on the tour, and our ranch had been selected that year. But what did I do? I brought along G.G. Simpson's The Meaning of Evolution, just published in paperback at the time, while the rest of the family climbed up on wooden fences and watched the parade of fine Hereford stock. I stayed in the car, enraptured by the Simpson, underlining the text and putting brackets in the margins. A couple of summers later, while trying to sell a method of cooking, Vitacraft's absolutely unpitiable aluminum last-a-lifetime cookware, I pulled my junk car to the side of the road and read Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage and Dostoevsky's The Idiot. That same day, I twisted the psychological arms of two sweet young high school graduates, but made no sale. Forsooth, that summer, I bought and read more books than I sold cookware. Early on, reading became for me a way of life. Joyous, fascinating, refreshing, challenging. It is out of that context that this book comes. I don't expect any reader to imitate my own lifestyle, nor to adopt point for point the precise values that I would at my best affirm. But I do want to announce at the beginning that I love reading and would like to help others love it too and do it better. Is this book for you? Primarily, this book is for Christians. That is not because I think there is a peculiar Christian way to read. I don't. Rather, reading well is a broadly human craft and can be practiced by any person with basic intelligence. In fact, most of this book should be useful to anyone who wants to learn how to read better. Still, I am most interested in encouraging Christians to think and read well. Christians of all people should reflect the mind of their Maker. Learning to read well is a step toward loving God with your mind. It is a leap toward thinking God's thoughts after Him. Since this book is directed toward Christians, I would ask those who do not consider themselves Christians to forgive the apparent oddness of some of what I say. Maybe, if you hear me out, by the end of the book, you won't think it quite so odd. To be specific then, I have three basic categories of readers in mind. First are the Christians who want to learn how to read better. I am thinking here of those of you who have not specifically studied reading in college, majoring in chemistry, engineering, or economics. You have practiced reading but never looked at it as a craft, something that can be isolated, studied, and learned. You have wanted to read primarily to know. Your goal has been utilitarian. Surely, one important function of reading is education, learning something we don't already know. I hope my book will help you learn better. But I would also like to think that you will come to appreciate reading for its own sake. For that will make everything you read a potential joy. Second are those of you who have studied literature in college and love it so much you will read anything, even a book on how to do better what you can't stop doing anyway. In this sense, perhaps this book will be a refresher course. Third are those of you who may be a captive audience. This book having been foisted on you by a well-intentioned teacher. From you I beg indulgence and a small act of faith. Maybe this won't be such a bad text after all. In one sense, this book is sequel to Universe. What, Gabe? I'm busy. In one sense, this book is a sequel to The Universe Next Door. In that book, I tried to isolate and define the various ways people today view life. The illustrations for this were drawn from various literary and philosophic works. Some have asked me how to read so that the world view of the author becomes obvious. How to read slowly is a rather long answer to that short question. But the question is an important one and deserves a careful response. Reading to understand worldviews is not something one is likely to do naturally. I was not taught to do this until I studied under Professor Donald Clark at the University of Missouri. I wish someone had taught me to do it sooner. In any case, once learned and practiced, it will stick with you, I trust. Become second nature. Models and maps. Every person carries in his head a mental model of the world, a subjective representation of external reality, writes Alvin Toffler in The Future Shock. This mental model is, he says, like a giant filing cabinet. It contains a slot for every item of information coming to us. It organizes our knowledge and gives us a place from which to argue. As E.F. Schumacher says, when we think, we do not just think, we think with ideas. Our mind is not a blank, a tabula rasa. When we begin to think, we can do so only because our mind is already filled with all sorts of ideas with which to think. These more or less fixed ideas we think with constitute our mental model of the world. In other words, our worldview. What are the major slots in our filing cabinet? Essentially, they include these basic concepts. 1, our concept of the most real thing in existence, our notion of God or of ultimate reality. 2, our view of the essential nature of the external world, ordered or chaotic, material or spiritual. 3, our idea of who we and others really are, our concept of human nature. This includes our idea of how we know epistemology and our notion of what happens to us after we die. 4, our understanding of the good, ethics, and 5, our understanding of the meaning of humanity's sojourn on Earth, the meaning of history. Our worldview, in other words, is a map of reality. Like any map, it may fit what is really there or may be grossly misleading. The map is not the world itself, of course, only an image of it, more or less accurate in some places, distorted in others. Still, all of us carry around such a map in our mental makeup, and we act on it. All of our thinking presupposes it. Most of our experience fits into it. That which does not challenges us to modify our worldview, or our worldview event prevents us from accepting the experience as vertical, really reflecting the way things are. When writers write, they do so from the perspective of their own worldview. What they presuppose about themselves, God, and the good life, and the validity of human knowledge governs both what they say and how they say it. That is why reading with worldviews in mind, your own and that of the author, will help you understand not only what is written in the lines, but what is written between the lines. That is, what is presupposed before a pen ever reaches the page. Some very good examples of this cry at us from billboards, magazine ads, and TV commercials. You only go around once in life, so you've got to grab for all the gusto you can get. Every TV sports addict knows that one by heart. The advertisement, of course, goes on to say we should drink Schlitz, because if you don't drink Schlitz, you don't get all the gusto you can. Leaving aside the question of whether Schlitz or any beer really gives gusto, relish, zest, keen enjoyment, says one dictionary, look at the argument itself and what must be assumed to be true if the argument is to be accepted. Item 1. You only go round once in life. This is a preposition about human nature. Human beings are born, live, die, and do not come back. Obviously, it rejects any idea of reincarnation. But notice item number 2. So you've got to grab for all the gusto you can get. For this to follow from item 1 must not only reject reincarnation, but any kind of life after death. For if there were some kind of life after death, then gusto here might not be appropriate under some circumstances. There might be a greater gusto beyond. So item 1 is really an assumption of naturalism. It will not square at all with the Christian view of human nature. For a Christian, there is a life beyond, one where the gusto will be greater than any offered here, even if it is true that Schlitz has gusto. We might further observe that the Schlitz ad, even for naturalists, singles out one value as primary enjoyment. It is an appeal to our hedonistic, self-centered nature. A principled naturalist who values others as much as himself should be no more satisfied with this ad than Christians who place the gratification of purely physical desires relatively low on their scale of values. Lest we think that only a beer commercial could be so crass, could take such a low view of human nature. Try the same analysis on the Coca-Cola ad. Coke adds life. Everybody wants a little life. Or this ad for a fur coat. Mink, one of life's great lessons in the fine art of accepting pleasure. Or this ad for a calculator. Buy this for someone, then give it to yourself. Every argument and ads are arguments good or bad, valid or invalid, moral or immoral, presupposes a common ground with the person to whom it is directed, a ground not in question. This is why pleasure-oriented people will respond to arguments for pleasure-producing things. It is also why arguments directed at one person will not work with someone else. Not enough is shared in common. Often, however, some presuppositions of a writer may go undetected because much of what he or she says seems so patently true, we never notice elements that would otherwise cause us to raise questions. Psychologist Kenneth B. Clark has written that the social sciences should be used to help us out of our modern predicament. We are about to blow ourselves off the face of the earth if we don't find some way of controlling our aggression. Mankind as a whole may not survive much longer. Clark writes, given the urgency of this immediate survival problem, the psychological and social sciences must be able to control the animalistic, barbaric, and primitive propensities in man and subordinate them to the uniquely human moral and ethical characteristic of love, kindness, and empathy. We see Clark's values and ours are similar: love, kindness, empathy. And we have a general respect for science, especially in the service of humanity. So we may think to ourselves as we read this, how true, how true. But have we noticed that what Clark has said about what our problem is? We have, he says, a tendency to animalistic, barbaric, primitive. These terms all point to Clark's underlying assumption, one which governs most thinking in the social sciences today, that the human race is evolving. The problem is that we have not yet evolved far enough. We must hasten the evolutionary process by scientifically manipulating human nature. Clark's own proposal in his essay, which comes from a national address to his fellow psychologists, is to manufacture a tranquilizer, a peace pill, which could be given to all those with the power to trigger an atomic explosion to keep them from pushing the button. In a later passage, his assumption of an evolutionary model is made explicit. He says the development of such psychotechnology will give us the time necessary to evolve and stabilize those centers of his man's brain, which will make social morality and human survival no longer a matter of chance. But if we are good readers, we don't need to be told that Clark assumes an evolutionary model for the human race, for he has tipped his hand much earlier. We may feel, however, that our problems as human beings do not stem from an incomplete evolution, but, say, from a fallen nature. If, in other words, we assume the biblical notion that humanity was created perfect in the first place, and that our problem is not the fact that we are animalistic. Animals are neither moral nor immoral or barbaric, not properly cultured, actually just a member of the wrong culture, or primitive, Adam and Eve were created perfect, then Clark's proposal is certainly questionable. The Bible puts the nature of our problem in moral terms. We rebelled against God. Our trouble is our moral character, not our physical nature or our improper culture. Detecting the presuppositions of others, therefore, is vitally important. It is a part of reading well. It puts our own worldview to the test, and it gives us a contact with the mind and heart of those we read and listen to. We begin, then, to come alive to the vast array of gods and goddesses vying for our worship, calling for our commitment, and we can better understand what to think and how to live in a culture growing ever more decadent. It isn't just in prose that we need to be aware of worldviews. There is a frequent misconception about poetry. Poetry, we hear people say, is just for emotion and feeling. Indeed, poetry does involve emotion and feeling, but at its best, it reflects our whole character. As Samuel Taylor Coleridge once said, no man was ever yet a great poet without at the same time being a profound philosopher. For poetry is the blossom of the fragrancy of all human knowledge, human thoughts, human passions, emotions, language. For example, at these two brief lyric poems, the first is by Stephen Crane, 1871 to 1900. Should the wide world roll away, leaving black terror, limitless night, not God, nor man, nor place to stand, would be to me essential. If thou and thy white arms were there, and the fall to doom a long way. What view of ultimate value and meaning does Crane express? All the meaning of human life is in the love between man and woman. To have that is to be able to withstand the destruction of all else but one's own self. Yet there is much more in these lines than this simple answer to life's profound question of meaning. There is tension and terror, a black backdrop against which one soul, light figure, stands starkly revealed. No final resting place, but doom is envisioned for the soul. No reason is given for the one value Crane affirms, but we are clear about the affirmation. Perhaps one reason why worldview issues are present in so much poetry is that poets so often combine two subjects close to the hearts of all of us, love and death. In the following poem by Emily Dickinson, 1830 to 1886, the subject is the same as that in Crane's poem, but there is much more doubt about the answer. I reason, earth is short, and anguish absolute, and many hurt, but what of that? I reason, we could die. The best vitality cannot excel decay, but what of that? I reason that in heaven, somehow it will be even, some new equation given, but what of that? Brief, clipped, like three snapshots, each recording a state of mind. This poem captures and compresses the essence of the poet's thoughts on death, and thus on human significance. Read the poem again. I reason, earth is short, and anguish absolute, and many hurt, but what of that? I reason, we could die. The best vitality cannot excel decay, but what of that? I reason that in heaven, somehow it will be even, some new equation given, but what of that? And then again, to capture its poignant reminder of how little we sometimes know. These two poems, of course, provide only glimpses of a larger whole from which they come. Crane and Dickinson have much more to say than this about the meaning of life. And We as readers have much more to learn about how to receive their messages than I have even hinted. My point in this section has been simply to illustrate what it means to read with the mind engaged, what it means to read in the light of worldview issues. Where are we going? The plan of this book is simple. Chapter 2 considers how to read straightforward nonfiction in such a way that we see not only what the writer intended, but also the intellectual background from which he writes. That is, what he presupposes to be true before he sets forth his case. From this will come a set of principles for reading any and all kinds of non-fictional works. Chapter 3 discusses how to read poetry with depth and understanding. And Chapter 4 takes up fiction, short stories, and novels. Chapter 5 explains the relevance of the biographical, literary, historical, and intellectual contexts in which written works participate and which influence their meaning. Finally, Chapter 6 suggests how you can know when and what to read. The appendix proposes a basic starter plan. Note, some of you may wish to read the chapter on poetry or the one on fiction prior to reading the chapter on nonfiction. This can be done without much difficulty. There are references to these chapters to the general discussion of the worldviews in Chapter 2. You may wish then to refer back to the material when this topic is mentioned. Some may wonder why I have not made prominent mention of Bible reading. There are two reasons for this. First, there are already many excellent books on how to read or study the Bible. But there is a more important reason. If we learn to read nonfiction, poetry, and fiction well, we are automatically equipped to read the Bible very well. To be sure, there are some important aspects unique to reading Scripture, and I discuss these later in the book. But reading well is a rather universally applicable craft. How to read slowly. Finally, I want to introduce a motive we will find repeated throughout this book. Reading speed is totally irrelevant. In fact, over and over in the next few chapters, I will ask you to read and then reread. At that rate, your speed will be abysmal, abysmal. Yeah. If you think you can learn to read well without doing this, I ask you to reread anyway. I am not insulting your intelligence by doing this. Good readers reread many things many times. When you have absorbed the techniques of reading well, you will automatically find your speed increasing. Don't take pride in this. The task we set before ourselves now has nothing to do with quantity. Senator Proxmire, some say, reads 2,500 words a minute. So what? The average reader reads about 250 words a minute. That is fast enough. Hamlet. What a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable. In action, how like an angel. In apprehension, how like a god. And yet, to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Shakespeare, Hamlet. Joseph Wood. Crutch has argued that whereas the traditional view supports Hamlet's exclamation, how like a god, Pavlov, the behavioral scientist, emphasized how like a dog. But that was a step forward. A god is the archetypal pattern of an explanatory fiction, of a miracle working mind, of the metaphysical. Man is much more than a dog, but, like a dog, he is within the range of scientific analysis. B.F. Skinner, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. Okay, that's the end of chapter 1. We're to read chapter 5 next. I will post this. And thank you for following along with our study.